welcome if you want to circulate it internally or what have you. Also, there is a Q&A feature of the webinar. So at the top or the bottom, depending on what platform you're using, there'll be a Q&A button. If you hit that, you can put in your questions as we go along, and I'll do my best to answer them as and when we go along. There will be opportunity at the end as well to ask any questions as well. The purpose of today's webinar is generally just to give you a very short, sharp introduction to Panda Security. I don't know if any of you are familiar with us, but the solutions that we offer has changed quite dramatically over the last few years. We tend to do an awful lot more than what people typically think. So yeah, let's get straight into it. Okay, so quick itinerary for you, or agenda for you. I'm going to give you an introduction to Panda just in case you haven't heard of us before. Then a little bit on threat data from our Pandalabs report. Every year we put a report out, so give you some insights there. Then EDR, so just in case anybody's not familiar with the term EDR, I'm going to put that into context. That's a new market sector, which is quite important. And then our journey, so Panda's journey within the EDR market sector, and then we're going to have a demo. The first 4 points are going to be pretty quick. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint by any means. It's going to be first 5 minutes presentation, and then the remaining approximately 25 minutes of a practical demonstration to show you exactly a hands-on, exactly what it looks like and everything like that. Okay, so let's dive straight in. So Panda, we're a Spanish-born company. Established in 1990. We have a global presence of 55 offices around the world. We originally started up by a group of friends, actually, in Bilbao, Spain, which is where our head office is located, which is where the name of the company originated. So at the time that the company was formed, there was a Spanish word in a local dialect which meant, which was Pandilia. And that meant group of friends or gang of friends, roughly translated. And of course, as the company grew and became a global company, they changed it from a Spanish word to an English word, and the word that they changed it to was Panda. So that's how we got our name. But yeah, I mean, we've come on leaps and bounds over the last few years, particularly in the EDR market space, which is what we're going to talk about quite a lot today. You can see 10% global share of that market space. Okay, so just moving on a little bit to some of the threat data that we have for 2018. This is actually from our Pandalabs annual report, 2018. If you Google it, you'll find it straight away. It's in amongst the top listings. It's very, very detailed. It's got an awful lot of interesting insights in there. For the purposes of today's webinar, I just picked out a few of the key points from the report that basically illustrate the fact that malware attacks are still very prevalent, if anything more so than ever, but also malwareless attacks. The example I picked out here being an RDP brute force attack. You can see they're incredibly popular from the stats on screen. And this is very much the growing challenge that we're facing. And as we'll go through, you'll see that the methodology that Panda's incorporated into our EDR solutions very much has traditional malware under control. So it's fantastic news, very, very big win for us there. But of course, there's always going to be emerging challenges for us moving forwards, which is the malwareless attacks. And I'll explain it all a little bit further on in the demonstration. Okay, so let's just move on to the next slide. With this slide, I just want to talk a little bit about EDR. So just in case anybody's not familiar with the term EDR, it stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. And it's a term that was coined by Gartner a few years ago. And it represents an entire new market sector, entire sub-market of the cybersecurity space. There's quite a number of companies that operate in it these days. Panda was the first traditional antivirus vendor to operate in that market space, to have an offering in that market space. The solutions that we have that sit within this space are Adaptive Defense and Adaptive Defense 360. I'll talk about it more as we go through so that it makes sense and it all clicks into place. But Adaptive Defense is EDR technology in isolation. And Adaptive Defense 360 is a combination of traditional antivirus and EDR technology. When I say traditional antivirus, what I mean is your rather conventional signature file-based detection methodology. So the security vendor has a list of malware in the form of signature files, and they compare it to what you've got on your endpoint. So this is what we refer to as traditional antivirus model. So since releasing Adaptive Defense and Adaptive Defense 360, we've really made headway with regards to getting malware under control. And when I say malware, what I'm talking about is entity-based malware, so malicious processes that run on the endpoints and do nasty things. This graph here is representing the malware infections that have been escalated to our Panda Labs, our research and development center. And you can see that progressively over the years, I mean, Adaptive Defense 360 was released in 2015, so this is a representation of effectively the result of our customer base taking up more and more of the Adaptive Defense 360 solutions over the antivirus solutions. So you can see progressively over the years, the blue line going down, and then subsequently the red line, the green line, and the purple line, until we're trending towards 0 at the tail end of last year. So this really is a great representation of how Panda have traditional malware under control. And in the next piece, I'm going to do a demonstration, which is actually going to show you the methodology behind that, how the solution works, and how we've achieved that. And then we'll move on to the future challenges and what we're doing about that. So I'm just going to tab through to another page here. So that we're on a web browser. This is actually the cloud configuration console for Adaptive Defense 360 solution. So the 360 one being the one that has antivirus and EDR incorporated. The reason that there's two flavors, by the way, of Adaptive Defense and Adaptive Defense 360 is so that you can run Adaptive Defense alongside a third-party antivirus if you wish. So it's important to understand EDR is not a replacement for antivirus. The two markets will coexist. EDR technologies and the market space in general only exist to complement technologies that already exist and are known as antivirus solutions. So it's just stepping things up a little bit, which is very much needed in today's cyberspace. So taking a look at the Cloud Console, you can see that this is the landing page. This is effectively where you would configure it. This is where IT administrators would log into. It's a real-time cloud configuration console, so you get the best of both worlds. It's real-time, like an on-prem solution, but it's in the cloud, so you can access it from anywhere. You don't have to update it. You don't have to have any kit or hardware to put it on. So it's really cool. It also works, of course, with the software which sits on the endpoint. So this is what the solution looks like on a Windows device. And it's got a number of features for which I'll go through shortly, but one of the key ones is, of course, that this is a business solution. So you can't actually do much from a user's perspective. When I click on this, I can scan my machine and I can see what's being blocked, but that's pretty much it, unless I've got the admin password to log in locally. So this is definitely, something targeted for businesses. Now, if we get into the methodology of the solution, how do we achieve keeping malware, entity-based malware under control? How do we get the numbers down, trending towards 0, with hardly any infections affecting our customers? So the methodology is really quite straightforward. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through a block, so as it would occur. So what we're doing here is we are creating or compiling some completely unique executable applications. And the problem that we have with the traditional model, where we're preventing malware, is when something's unknown. So for instance, zero-day malware or ransomware, which is very difficult to collect for a sample, very often is not in cybersecurity, the cyber vendors, security vendors database. And when that happens, of course, the default behavior for traditional antivirus is to allow the execution. So either it's known malware or it's allowed to execute. That's the traditional model. The problem with that, of course, is that if we don't have a signature file, then very often the customer still becomes infected. So to prevent that problem, to get around it, we effectively do the exact opposite. Instead of trying to stop the bad, we only allow the good. So for in this instance, I've generated these executable files. They've never existed anywhere in the world apart from my laptop for a few seconds, so we have no prior knowledge of them whatsoever. We don't know if they're good, we don't know if they're bad, or whatever. So if I click on one of these, you'll see immediately that the execution was blocked and it was flagged as an untrusted program. So effectively what's happening here is we've said, okay, well, we don't know one way or the other. We don't know if it's good, we don't know if it's bad, so we're going to block it immediately from the offset. But in addition to that, what we do is we collect a sample automatically. So on my machine, this file is actually being uploaded to the Panda Cloud infrastructure for automatic classification. So this is where it's very much a SaaS model. It's very much security as a service as opposed to just an antivirus, which is effectively just a product. So this is the way that market's going. But of course, if we have a look here, this was blocked from execution, but we still don't know whether it's good or bad, and the classification service will take care of that for us. So in the Cloud Console, we can see currently blocked programs being classified. This is where the IT administrators will be able to come and identify things that have been, processes that are being blocked on the endpoints within the estate of machines that they're looking after. And through here, the administrators, of course, have absolute control. So you can come in and unblock something that's been blocked if you are certain that it's safe. But in any case, if you don't do that, then we will classify it. Every single process that executes on a Windows device is classified by the solution automatically. So effectively, what you end up with is a situation where only legitimate, trusted applications can run by default, and everything gets classified regardless. That puts us in a really strong position because it means effectively you're not going to be able to get malware unless someone comes in and allows it to happen. So if an administrator comes in and unblocks it, well, that's a different matter. But by default, the solution is just effectively going to only allow the things that Panda's already checked. But secondly, it means it's not possible for you to harbor malware. So you can't actually have malware on a system and not know about it. Even if an administrator comes through here and unblocks it initially, we still classify that sample. It's still going to be classified. And that brings up an interesting point, actually. What's the solution do if that situation does unfold? And occasionally it has done within a customer base. So we have this widget over here, programs allowed by the administrator, and you can see it breaks it down for us. So those still being classified, but of course, the ones we're concerned about is malicious samples or pubs. So from the point at which we classify something, the solution gains a classification of something being malicious, it will override the administrator's exclusion. This can be changed, but it's the default behavior of the solution. Our classification of any given file will override the administrator's decision to allow it to run in the first place. And that should give you some indication as to how confident we are with the classification. In fact, the classification service is a centralized service. So if it's classified as malware, then it's automatically blocked and remediated worldwide. And the reason that we're able to do this is because we're leveraging machine learning and neural networks to do the classification for us. Panda initially conceptualized this solution about 9 years ago. So it's been a long way in the making, and we're at the point now where the classification is so good that it's almost, if not better, than when we had real people doing the reverse engineering. So it's incredibly effective at preventing malware infections in that way. So the next question, if that scenario was to unfold, if an IT admin allowed the execution of an unknown file, and effectively that resulted in a malware outbreak, okay, the solution will rectify that, but it might take a couple of hours for the classification to happen. Actually, that's a good point. Classification can take up to 24 hours, depending on workload and various other things. Very often it's minutes. But in any case, let's just run with the scenario. The administrator's allowed something that's unknown. It's run on the endpoint. It's actually being classified as malware. In that interim period of time where it was running, what happened? What's the impact to the business? And this is another key area where Adaptive Defense and Adaptive Defense 360 does very well, because the software on the endpoints is actually collecting forensic analytics. So it's thousands of data points which are effectively collected from every single Windows device to which this is installed. And we can leverage that in the solution in various different ways. One way is the malware activity. So in the unlikely scenario, and we have to consider all scenarios, in the unlikely scenario that an IT administrator allows malware to execute on the network, then we can see it in here. This effectively is a list of all execution attempts, whether they've been allowed to run or not, but this is all execution attempts which have resulted in a malicious classification. So these processes are malware effectively. And they've tried to run. The first column here is showing us whether these processes have in fact been allowed to execute on the endpoint. So has an administrator overridden the default methodology of the solution and allowed these processes to run on the endpoints? And you can see here it's very clear if that's the case. The next column across is a little bit more interesting. This is showing you whether the process accessed any data on the endpoint. Obviously, a very important topic. The third column is showing us whether the malicious process made any external connections. So very useful information. If we click into one of these samples, we can drill down in more detail. So at the top, it essentially from top to bottom explains the process in plain English. The administrator has allowed the threat to run on all computers. And then we can see that we classified this one as a Trojan, and then subsequently we automatically disinfected it. You can see which machine we're talking about, the location of the particular file, quick links to other third-party platforms if we want to extend our research, but crucially, we've got the origin of the malicious outbreak. So where was the malware initially executed from, and by which user did that occur? We can also see other occurrences on the network as well. Now we can drill down into more detail. If we go into the activity details, this is now really getting a little bit more granular. It's showing us effectively a step-by-step account of everything that's happened as a result of the malware being allowed to execute by an admin in the first place. And bear in mind, this is all only relevant if an administrator overrides the default methodology of the solution. The solution will only allow processes to run that Panda already knows to be safe by default. So for this to be relevant, the administrators have to override that initially. So if we have a look in here, we can see that the malicious payload created some registry items. It then performed loopback tests. It's broken out to a command and control server on the internet here and downloaded some additional payloads. And we can continue to go through it in this fashion. But alternatively, we can also visualize it in a visual way. This is the activity graph, exactly the same information, but just visually represented. Here in the center, we can see the malicious payload, which was allowed by the IT administrator. And everything that surrounds it are the events that occurred as a result of that being the case. At the bottom, we've got this little nifty timeline, so we can actually scroll backwards and step through everything in sequence, so we understand exactly what happened when and what order it all happened. And this is crucial for businesses. If they do find themselves in a scenario where there is malware on a system, then of course, what's the potential impact of the business? With traditional antivirus, you don't have an awful lot to go off of besides maybe Googling symptoms. So filling customers in or organizations in on what the impact of their business is quite difficult with a traditional solution. If we take another quick example, I'll show you the activity graph for this one. This one is where malware actually accessed a document on the file system, and then we can see that the malicious process communicated online with a server online. So this gives us a very good indication that this document may well have been exfiltrated from the organization. And of course, that can have various ramifications. If it's intellectual property, then there may be strategic things that the business wants to do. If it's personal information, then it should be reported to the authorities, the ICO. If it's a web browser cache, then it could mean potentially that a lot of their online services or passwords for online services have been compromised. So there's various considerations to be had should malware be allowed to execute on an endpoint. And bear in mind, with traditional antivirus, the default is to just allow anything that we don't know to be malware to run. Whereas with this solution, only the things that we know are safe are allowed to run by default. Complete opposite. Okay, so that's what we call the 100% classification service, and it's sort of represented by this tally here, classifications of all programs run and scanned. So it's a comprehensive classification service for all of the services and processes that you're running on Windows devices. There is another big part of the solution though. So as I said before, I alluded to earlier, there is a huge amount of data which is collected from the endpoints. And all of this information is collated in a huge database in our cloud infrastructure. Now, we use this real-world information, this real-world pool of data for research purposes to discover new infiltration techniques that cyber attackers have developed and so forth. But similarly, we also use it for something we call the Threat Hunting Investigation Service. So that is acronym THIS, this. And the Threat Hunting Investigation Service effectively is where we take that real world data and we decide to apply monitoring through that database. And this enables us to identify instances of malwareless attacks or living off the land attacks where admin tools are used against the organization. And these are the types of attacks which are a lot more difficult to catch, where it's not an entity-based malware attack, but it is in fact just using legitimate software, legitimate processes to do malicious things like exfiltrate information or maybe gain a foothold in the network and so forth. So these sorts of attacks, they need to be looked at in context, and that's what we can do in a database. We can see whether something looks like anomalous behavior or whether it looks suspicious. If we go back to the example I was referring to earlier with a RDP brute force attack, effectively an RDP brute force attack is where a cyber attacker manages to connect to an RDP server and they effectively run some software that has a lot of passwords against the login screen to that server until eventually they get in. Now, this can very often take days, weeks, or even months. I've seen them extend into 6 months just trying to basically guess or crack the password for a server. And of course, whilst this is going on, in many cases, the IT teams for those organizations are absolutely oblivious to this happening. And this is where the threat hunting investigation service really shines. So it's probably the most popular alert that we send out, to be honest, because we have, of course, with the forensic analytics, the visibility to identify all these failed logon attempts and the suspicious activity that's going on the endpoint level. And so the service effectively is not just the monitoring, but of course to proactively alert you to the fact that this is going on so that you can take relevant action to thwart or mitigate the attack before it's even got started. An RDP brute force is just one of about 500 different scenarios that we monitor for proactively. So it's a fantastic service to have included straight out of the box as standard, no configuration required. It's just across the board standard, something that we provide for everyone. So there's two core key services there that you're getting above and beyond what a traditional antivirus would provide. The 100% classification, meaning it's impossible for you to harbor any malware on the endpoints because every single process is checked and verified. Obviously, by default, only legitimate processes are allowed to run. And then you've got the threat hunting investigation service, which takes care of being more proactive and monitoring for the malwareless attacks. Now, if we jump quickly into the configuration for this, and just show you a little bit around some of the different features with regards to configuring it. We have a couple of different modes for the classification, the pre-execution blocking and classification service. Initially, you would start off in hardening mode. This is effectively the learning phase, where we're learning what processes you've got. And just in case you've got anything proprietary, we don't want to be blocking it from the day one. So you run in hardening mode for a short time, usually around 2 weeks. And then once everything's been classified, then we would switch you into lock, or you can switch yourself into lock. And then everything's locked down to just those applications we know are safe. With this, you also get the anti-exploit engine. This takes care of monitoring proactively the processes that are legitimate, because of course they can be exploited in various different ways. And again, this is another area where the forensic information really backs us quite a lot, because we have real world information, forensic analytical information about what a given process should be doing, what looks like normal behavior across the tens of millions of endpoints that we protect. We've seen millions and millions of executions of all the most common business apps. So if it starts to do something that's way out of the ball court, so to speak, then that triggers the anti-exploit engine to kill that process in memory. Okay, so everything that I've discussed so far is essentially the methodology, the way in which the adaptive defense solution works, the EDR technology that we provide. That can be purchased to run alongside a third-party antivirus. But if you go for the 360 version, then you also benefit from Panda's antivirus being encompassed in the same solution. So with this, of course, you have access to configure all the antivirus. There's an endpoint firewall. Device control is our USB blocking capabilities. Web access control is URL filtering capabilities. Again, all real time, all propagates to the endpoints, and you can select different categories here to block different categories of websites. So it's all very, very intuitive, very straightforward, and easy to use. If we click into computers, you'll notice that it is in fact cross-platform, but I have been mentioning Windows quite a lot. So most of the features, particularly the EDR features, the adaptive defense on its own features, are Windows only. However, if you have Adaptive Defense 360, then you can install Mac, Linux, and Android into the solution as well, and it will give you the antivirus, so signature file-based antivirus for all platforms included. For Mac and Linux, you would also benefit from the URL filtering piece, which is the web access control, so filtering out different categories of websites. And for Android devices, you can have anti-theft features enabled, which enables you to locate the devices and trigger remote alarms and so forth. It's actually quite a neat one here to snap the thief. So when they touch the screen, it takes a picture of them and sends it to you along with the GPS coordinates. So there's a number of different aspects depending on which platform it is. Predominantly, we find most people have a lot of Windows devices, so that's why it's across the board supported on Windows. If we click into a Windows device, there's a couple of other neat features here. So in fact, this is a cross-platform feature. Of course, you get all the information that you are likely to need. So you can see IP addresses, MAC addresses, Active Directory path. We're also going to be included last logged in user very soon. So lots of information there. Also, if we scroll down a bit, you can see which parts of the solution are enabled or disabled. The hardware tab is going to show you sort of hardware specifications that you've got for the device, and this again is cross-platform, even on Android. So last 24-hour CPU activity, we do the same for memory, we do the same for disk, and all the specs in there as well. We have a look under software. We can see all the software that's currently installed to the device, or we can look at retrospectively what has been installed or uninstalled from the device. We can also search this if we like to show Microsoft patches that are currently applied. Down the left-hand side, we've got all these filters. This enables us to filter based off the hardware and software information, so we can find, all the devices that have a particular bit of software or hardware spec. And these are fully customizable. You can create as many as you want. You can edit them and play with them as you see fit. So you may be wondering what these flashing dots are on a lot of the Windows devices. So if I click into one of these, in the top right-hand corner, there's a little icon. It looks a bit like a Nike handbag, I think. But if we click on that, you can see we actually have the ability to isolate a device as well. And bear in mind, this is a cloud console. But because we hold an open socket to all of the endpoints, then it will actually apply immediately. So we can isolate any device that we're looking after directly through the cloud console, as long as it's got an internet connection, and propagate over the internet immediately and isolate that device. The isolation is effectively a software lockdown on the device. You can put exceptions in place if you want. Okay, there's also, we're a little short on time, so I am glossing over this fairly quickly, but the solution also comes with the ability to uninstall third-party antivirus solutions automatically, and there's a distribution feature in there as well, so you can deploy it over your local network using the solution itself. So hopefully that gives you, a very good beginner's introduction to the Adaptive Defense or Adaptive Defense 360 solutions. But it doesn't stop there. There's a whole lot of scalability because there's some additional modules that can be bolted on. So if we have a look here down the left-hand side, we've got a patch management option, and it's important to note none of the modules require any additional software to be rolled out. It's no overhead whatsoever. It's just a case of being licensed for it and configuring it in the Cloud Console immediately. The patch management module effectively does Windows patching, but also third-party software as well. There's hundreds of third-party software packages covered. You can see that by default, the solution will automatically populate an audit for you, which you can click on and export to provide to the customer or whoever you need to provide that to. And because it's a real-time cloud console, you can patch on an ad hoc basis in real time. So we could just select a few relevant patches, either schedule for the future or hit the install button to do it immediately. So it's incredibly intuitive, very straightforward. If we go into tasks, we could view the results of what I just pushed out, see whether it's installed yet or not, or we could go into install patches on a periodic basis, so effectively setting up a periodic task here. And of course, we set up the date and time we want it to start. We can choose which devices we want to target with this, the criticality of patching, and any reboot preferences at the bottom. It's dead simple. One of my favorite parts of the patch management module is the ability to roll back. So if we quickly jump into one of these, and I'll quickly try and find a good example here. So we clicked in, we're looking at the patch installation history. I've clicked into a specific patch that was installed previously. We can see all the relevant information for this, KB numbers, description, everything like that. But what I think is really cool is the uninstall patch button. Now with this, I could select to uninstall this patch, or roll back the patch on every single device that it was deployed to with a single click of a button. So in some cases, it can save you an awful lot of time if there's a bad patch released. Okay, so that's patch management. We also have an encryption module. This effectively leverages our cloud console to control BitLocker. So it's very effective at being a real-time BitLocker centralized control panel. You can see some of the widgets in here are very useful. So in the top right-hand corner, which computers are actually going to support the encryption, or in other words, which computers have BitLocker. Further down, we've got the status of your encrypted computers. So we will actually effectively pick up if the device is already encrypted using BitLocker and report it in the Cloud Console. So that can be quite handy, along with the authentication method that's been applied, whether it's a pre-boot password or just a TPM chip or what have you. Configuring this is dead simple as well. Just very quickly jump into the configuration section. You can see it's 4 toggles. Do you want to encrypt the disk, decrypt the disk, like so, or do you want a boot password, and do you want to encrypt the full disk or not, and so forth. It's very, very easy. One of the features with this on an ongoing basis is to store the recovery keys. So if someone was to leave the organization and you don't know their pre-boot password, then you can simply get the recovery key through the Cloud Console like so. So it's very, very convenient. Okay, another module, the third module, is the data control module, and I am just going to skip over this. This is quite a big one, but of course, the purpose of this demo is just to give you an introduction. If any of this is touching on something that you want to know more about, or you want to have a greater conversation, then reach out to your Exerce account manager. He can set up a one-to-one session between myself and anybody in attendance so that we can discuss it in length and more customized to your situation. But this one is a GDPR module. Effectively, this will give you the ability to identify where personal information exists in document format on the endpoint level. It gives an awful lot of information, in fact. So for instance, we can see credit card numbers, we can see the 67 documents across all of the devices that we've got Panda on that have credit card numbers in them. If we scroll to the bottom, there's a search function, so we could literally search anything that we want, but it would then search for that phrase or whatever in whether that phrase exists within a document format on any of the endpoints. In this instance, we've searched for John Murdoch. It's pulled back 4 different documents across 2 different devices. If I select one of these, we can see that it was created by Robert. Are there any other personal information in there? Created, modified, and last access dates, and so forth. We can also delete documents through this console as well if we wanted to. If we identified we had a right to be forgotten request or something like that, then we could search for documents containing that person's information and delete them directly through the Cloud Console, which is kind of handy. The last one, in fact, there's another part to data control, to be fair. Anybody that gets data control will effectively get access to a SIEM platform, which is essentially access to the database that sits behind what I just showed you. So all the information that's correlated in that other screen here is all pulled out of this database, and you can have unfettered access to the database. You can query this data in various ways, get all sorts of insights out of it. It shows a little bit more data. So for instance, it will actually show you the operations performed against documents containing Pi. All this information goes back about 12 months. So you've got a historic log, rolling log for 12 months, but you can see if documents have been deleted, copy and pasted, and so forth that contain personal information. You can also see which user was performing that operation, which computer they did it on, what date and time it occurred, and so forth. And this can be used effectively to track documents as well. So for instance, if you want to know if anybody's copy and pasted a document from their work PC onto a USB stick, then you could write a query and extract that information and find out if anybody's done that. You can also use that query as a proactive monitor as well, so you know if anybody had done that moving forwards in the future. And that's just one example out of countless different ways in which you could leverage this data. The last bolt-on module that I want to discuss very, very briefly is actually relating to the forensic information that we was talking about near the beginning. So part of the threat hunting investigation service is that we collect that forensic information using the software on the endpoint. But if you wanted to, we can also bolt on access to the same SIEM tool, the same console that we're in right now, to gain access to the forensic information. So here we can see this is the data tables for the forensic information. The ops table, for example, is correlating all the information to show us which processes have been run on endpoints, which users run them, what computer they were run on, what date and time, and so forth. Process net bytes is the amount of data that's sent and received by individual processes across every device. Socket table is showing us sockets that have been established, so we can see whether processes are communicating to servers in Russia or China or what have you. Also, we could identify whether there's peer-to-peer software being used. Through the ops table, we could write a query to identify that, or if particular ports, connections on particular ports are being established, and so forth. So there's a myriad of ways in which this database can be leveraged by companies. It's quite extensive. So I hope I've given you some sort of idea as to the scope of our capabilities. It's an awful lot more than traditional antivirus. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot more to think about with endpoint security these days, particularly as endpoint devices become more mobile. They do, unfortunately, become more of a target. Um, Okay, so at this point, I think I'll open it up to some questions. If anybody's got any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box at the top. If you want to know any more information in a great degree, then reach out to your Exertis account manager, book a demo in, or you can get a trial set up. You can run a 30-day trial of the solution. We do also have another console specifically for partners, which enables you to set up proof of concepts yourself as a reseller or a Panda partner. It's a whole console. We haven't got time to show you, unfortunately, but effectively, you can be fairly self-sufficient in setting up new consoles and effectively giving licenses, provisioning licenses, and so forth. So, any questions? I'm just waiting to see if anybody's got any questions to pop in the box. Anyone at all? Just give it another 10 seconds or so. Okay, awesome. Well, it doesn't appear to be any questions. I hope that was slightly insightful. I hope you learned something, and I hope it maybe changed your perspective of Panda if you knew of us before. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day. I appreciate everyone's busy, and I'll hopefully be speaking to you at some time soon. Thank you very much.